This Matcha Mugwort Ganache and the mochi I'm going to put inside were inspired by a lot of the desserts I had when I was in Korea around Chuseok a couple of years ago and a few years before that. So I'm starting off with a pastry cream style ganache. So I have some cornstarch, cream, white chocolate, butter, and then I also have some mugwort or sukaru, the mugwort powder. It's really fluffy. It has this really dark green color. It's really strong. And then I have some matcha powder as well. I have some of the cream that I'm mixing with my cornstarch in a small bowl, and I'll set that off to the side. Then the rest of the cream is going into a small saucepan with some vanilla. Now I want to add the matcha and the mugwort into my ganache into this cream in my saucepan, but first I'm going to whisk it into my sugar to try to help it incorporate a little bit more easily. If we just dump those powders right in, it can clump up a little bit and separate, which it will a little bit anyway until this heats up. But incorporating it into the sugar first is going to help a bit. Now I'm going to whisk this together and then get this saucepan onto my heat to start off this ganache. Now I am using a pastry cream style ganache, so we will cook this like a pastry cream, but if that is too complicated or if it feels too challenging for you, it is a more technically advanced pastry recipe. You can use these same flavor combinations in a more standard white chocolate ganache recipe, but instead of mixing the matcha and mugwort into your sugar and cream, just add it right into your cream. So because this is a pastry cream style mixture, after I've heated up the cream in the saucepan to about a scald, I'm going to temper that into the cream and cornstarch, then transfer everything back into my small saucepan and whisk it continuously on a low heat until it thickens up. You do want this to get quite nice and thick. It can start to bubble. You might see a couple bubbles rising up from the bottom, but you do not want to overcook this. You also really do not want to overheat this. So make sure the heat stays on low, that you stay there and whisk constantly so it doesn't curdle or overcook on the bottom, and don't allow it to just sit and continue to cook forever, as if it gets too hot or if it cooks too long, that can lead to separation later in the ganache, and that is really hard to come back from. Now that this matcha cream has thickened up really nicely, I'm bringing it over. I have partially melted my white chocolate, and then I have my room temperature unsalted butter. I am going to pour the matcha cream onto the top of my chocolate. Now, the reason I partially melted that already was so the cream doesn't have to work quite so hard to melt all of the chocolate. Then I am going to stir this together after leaving it for just a couple of seconds to allow the the heat from the cream to really work its way into the chocolate so everything combines really smoothly. Then I'm going to leave that on my counter for about 15 to 20 minutes to allow it to cool down until it is about just warmer than room temperature. I want it to be warm but not hot. That is so important for this recipe. Then I'm going to get in there with my immersion blender first, emulsify everything, make sure it looks really nice and smooth, and then start adding in my room temperature unsalted butter in a little bit at a time, mixing after each addition. I will continue to emulsify this until all the butter is incorporated, and then I'm going to stop mixing. This is not a whipped ganache. It is not a ganache that will whip in any pleasing way. So if you keep blending this after you add in the butter for a really long time, you can start to incorporate a lot of air, which is not ideal for this recipe. So once the butter is incorporated, transfer out the ganache into a new bowl or into a sheet pan lined with plastic wrap. The reason I usually use a sheet pan lined with plastic wrap is because it allows me to create one really thin layer that is going to give me a ton of surface area. So if you have a really shallow dish like this, that is fine as well. Then make sure to cover the top with plastic wrap so that a skin doesn't form, and then allow this to cool completely. Now, the next thing I wanted to do, because I have had so many matcha mugwort, mochi, or the like rice cake kinds of things, and I was especially inspired again by a lot of the treats I've had around Chuseok, the holiday in Korea, I wanted to have some sort of rice cake element. So I decided to make my own mochi here. I just have some rice flour, I have some sugar, and then some hot water, and then I'm going to stir everything together, microwave it, stir it again, and then that is basically it. Mochi is so easy to make. I really had mixed feelings about this. I loved it as an experiment. I love eating and making mochi, or the Korean word for this sort of thing. But because macarons are refrigerated and frozen or refrigerated again, it doesn't maintain the really nice texture necessarily, especially if these macarons sit for a while. The first couple of days they were fine, but after that the mochi got really hard, which, you know, is to be expected, but it was still a fun experiment. I think if you bought the tiny little mochi that you sometimes find in like a frozen yogurt store or like on the top of bingsu or something, if you get those from the store, I think they have enough preservatives in them to actually keep their texture even if they've been refrigerated, but possibly. So you might want to give that a try, or if you want to try out mochi on the inside of your macarons, you can give this a try as well. So after mixing my rice flour, a glutinous rice flour, and sugar and water mixture, after it's been heated, I just dumped it out onto my counter and then patted it down so it was in a nice really thin layer, making sure to use, you can use cornstarch or like powdered sugar or something. Just make sure that you have something so that you can touch the surface without it pulling back onto your hands. And then I am just going to cut it up into little pieces so I can put that in my macarons. Again, I don't necessarily think this was my brightest idea ever. I think it was a very fun idea to try out. It was really good. Again, like the first day, I loved having that like mochi or tteok texture on the inside of the macarons, but long term, not ideal. But I still recommend making mochi in your home kitchen if you haven't tried that already. All right, my mochi are made, the ganache is cooled. It's time to fill my macaron shells. I just went with a two-tone swirl green macaron shell here because I wanted to have those similar colors from the matcha and the mugwort, and I wanted to show that there were those two different flavors going inside, which is why I went with a swirl macaron shell. And I'm just piping a ring of the ganache around the outside of the macaron, and I'll put a little piece of mochi on the center. If you are just using the ganache, this would be lovely on its own. You can just pipe one bulb or just one huge ring of the ganache. If you wanted to pair this with another flavor, matcha and mugwort are quite dominant and intense flavors. But if you wanted to pair it up with something like raspberry or something that had vanilla, or if you wanted to get another texture in here, if you have a praline or something, you could go in several different directions if you wanted to have the ganache paired with something else. After I get all of these filled, I'm going to sandwich them and get them into my refrigerator for at least 24 hours before serving them. For a ganache-filled macaron, usually those mature a bit more quickly, at least in my experience, just because there's a lot of moisture in there as compared to a buttercream filling. But depending on how long you have cooked your macaron shells, how liquid your ganache is, the conditions of your environment, all of these different things, you might have a different result in your kitchen. So it's really important to play around with this and to know for you in your kitchen what is best, how long your macarons take to mature, and all of that. Thank you so much for tuning in to this matcha mugwort macaron recipe. I hope you give it a try if you've never worked with mugwort before. It is so interesting and I love experimenting with it. I hope you do too. All right, until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.